Oh boy, I am so excited. Today we have a disruptor. Now, again, this podcast is made about for disruptors and status quo breakers. And my guest today is Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Uh, I got to tell you, audience, I have one of his books here. What we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about his history, but the more investigation I did of his background, I never realized, Colonel, just what a disruptor you are and what you were in the Army. And in my mind, you weren't just a colonel in the Army. I mean, you're part of the history of the U.S. Army. So, wow. Thank you so much for being on here.
Well, it's nice of you to include me since large numbers of retired four-stars have tried to write me out of the history. So I appreciate somebody trying to write me back in.
Well, I tell you what, it's funny you mentioned that because I was introduced to you through your guest appearances on Tucker Carlson. And by the way, your name is known in this house because when I turn on Tucker and I see you, I'm like, Jen, McGregor's on, get in here. We got to watch. So, and I think you're saying what a lot of veterans are saying and what a lot of veterans believe and their families believe, that I think a lot of us are very unhappy with our senior military leadership. And frankly, I live on LinkedIn. And when I see some of these four stars doing leadership workshops and speaking, I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, I guess General Westmoreland wasn't available, right? So I'm not impressed. And the fact is that you have be able to, you've spoken the truth to power, I think, as George Marshall was known for. And I think a lot of people, because of you, people realize that not everything is rosy in the senior military ranks. And the fact that we just left Afghanistan in such disgrace, I think really has raised that awareness. So, and you were a big part of that. So thank you from my household for speaking the truth.
Well, my pleasure. Thanks. I appreciate it. I also, I'm also deeply saddened by the experience of so many veterans over the last 20 years. I could probably add the other 10 on there, 30, but certainly for the last 20 years, when they wake up and discover that, frankly, a lot of the people at the top have felt nothing but contempt for them and have simply used them however they saw fit in order to advance their own interests. I think that's probably the single most distressing aspect of the last 20 years. Just look at the people who've enriched themselves and profited enormously, but have ultimately done nothing. And we've always had a problem, to be blunt with you, with not enough senior officers who shared the danger and risks of their troops. That's not a new phenomenon, but I think it reached its all-time low point over the last 20 years. And I recall receiving a phone call from Newt Gingrich when I was still on active duty, and I had planned over everyone's objections an offensive on Baghdad that employed far fewer numbers. But of course, the original intent was not to stay in Iraq, which made absolutely no sense to do so, but we did it anyway. But he was concerned because once we were there in May and June, and I had said, well, when are we leaving? Of course, the sticking point at that stage was, oh, well, we've got to stay to find Saddam Hussein. And we had already discussed ways to do that would have gotten us out, but won't go into that. But he said, what do we do about all of these improvised explosive devices, these command detonated mines? They're starting to do a lot of damage. What do you think we should do? I said, well, that's very simple. He said, really? I said, yes, you need to do what Sir Gerald Templer did when he was in command in Malaya. The Field Marshal Templer had been a battalion and brigade commander during World War II in North Africa and Europe. And Templer, when he was brought in, an armor officer, obviously, first thing he said was every senior officer in the theater, this is in Malaya, will go on a patrol, foot patrol or motorized patrol every 2 weeks. And they will do so as members of the crew or squad or platoon, whatever it turns out to be. They will not go with an elaborate security detail. And so very quickly, just imagine what happened. The patrolling stopped because these brigadiers and major generals didn't particularly care to be blown to pieces. And they realized very quickly, what's the point of going out and patrolling these routes over and over and over again that simply sets you up for destruction and casualties that you don't want to take? Then he said, well, what else did he do? I said, well, the other thing he did is he announced to the Malays that they were leaving. The British were leaving Malaya. I said, we ought to tell these Iraqis that we're not staying. We will leave. Oh, no, we can never do that. I said, well, we will. You know, Iraq's not the 51st state. We will leave. But then Templer outlined in great detail the conditions that had to be met before the British could withdraw. Have to set up a court system, have to have a penal system, have to have a police force, you know, all these kinds of things. Well, suddenly the casualties dropped dramatically. And most of the Malays who were part of the resistance simply said, well, they're leaving, let's go home. So they went home. The British found they were fighting a small number of Chinese communists, as opposed to thousands and thousands of Malays who wanted to drive the British out of their country. None of these things were accepted. No one could do any of those things. It was sort of bizarre. Why would we indicate to these people that we would stay in Iraq forever? It's just an utterly stupid idea. But I think it was part of this sort of a narcissistic view that, you know, we had to impose ourselves on people, whatever it took. But then you had the other problem. The other problem that came up was, of course, Fallujah in the spring of 2004. And this was just before I left. And again, I was asked, you know, what do we do? I said, well, first of all, you bring every tank, every gun, and you completely cut off and surround Fallujah. Only one way in and one way out. Everybody has 48 hours to get out who wants to survive and doesn't want to be part of the, you know, the growing cemetery that's going to emerge as a result of this. And I said, you just put them into a little internment area so that all of the intelligence officers can find out who these people are and record them. And I said, then after 48 hours, you go in on 2 axes on the ground. He said, well, why aren't you going to bomb it? I said, no, we don't need to bomb it. We need to go in with artillery guns and direct fire, 155s. So you can take down a whole city block with a couple of salvos. And you just go block by block. Whatever refuses to surrender dies. And you keep this up until you essentially conquered Fallujah. He said, well, my God, you're going to end up destroying Fallujah. I said, yeah, it's very likely. So what do you do then? I said, well, you should take photographs and distribute them across Iraq and make it clear that anyone who opposes us or attacks an American soldier, Marine, sailor, airman, whatever, this is the fate of those who attack us. And then the answer came back, and this is a very interesting answer. Oh, we can never do that. And I said, well, then it's time to leave. Because if you do anything else, it will just get worse. And of course, it got progressively worse. But we don't understand, never understood from the very beginning, that if you're going to intervene in this part of the world, there's no nice way to do it. You would like to do it minimizing casualties and minimizing the numbers of human beings whose lives have to be destroyed. We all want to do that. But inevitably, what we precipitated was going to happen. We were precipitating the emergence of opposition. Then you have to crush it mercilessly, completely, ruthlessly. And we can't do that because our quote unquote values won't permit it. Well, then it's time to leave. Don't stay. Just pull out. And of course, the answer is, oh, we can never just leave. But that's exactly what we always do. We just leave. And the people in Washington who were so dedicated to keeping us in Iraq and places like that were doing everything in their power to keep us there indefinitely, because they know from experience that once we leave, and Vietnam is a perfect example, we don't go back. And so the effort in Afghanistan and Iraq is quite similar. It's not to accomplish anything. It's to keep us there indefinitely. That creates a money flow for all the wrong people and all the wrong reasons. And it disguises the utter futility of your intervention from being revealed to the American people. So the longer you're there and the fewer casualties you take, the better off you are rather than simply getting out. And you minimize your casualties very simply by not doing a lot of the things that you did to begin with, and building up these fortresses, these forward operating bases. Of course, all of this is destructive to an armed force. You know, as Genghis Khan said, he refused to occupy anything. And so he said, occupations turn soldiers into jailers.
Oh, wow.
So the Mongolian armies never occupied anything. They would leave a small garrison to back an indigenous government. And provided the government paid its taxes or tribute to the Khan, quite frankly, the Mongols didn't care what happened in the country. But if the government suddenly decided they weren't going to pay the tribute or they were going to strike out independently, well, then the Mongols would send a number of Tumans back and level the place to make the point. It was an object lesson. But they didn't occupy. Occupations are destructive. They ruin armed forces.
You know, this is not Monday night back. Was it quarterbacking? But I remember years ago. I've told you before. I've had several guests, and one was Dr. Scheuer. I know him and others. And on the topic of Afghanistan, had always argued that we should have done a punitive expedition. Go in there, kill who you need to kill, destroy what you need to destroy, and leave. And if they come back, you do it again, but you do not occupy.
Oh, no, absolutely. And there's nothing to occupy. See, I was in a discussion last night, and they were talking about China. And I said, well, you know, China is an interesting test case for people who want to intervene and occupy. So the Japanese discovered when they entered China, there was nothing in China but Chinese. And they ended up with 1 million soldiers and administrators and bureaucrats stuck perpetually in China, dealing with what was a difficult and hostile population. So the Japanese discovered pretty quickly this has been a huge mistake. The problem was that every time they tried to negotiate with Chiang Kai-shek, they couldn't come to an arrangement that would allow them to, quote unquote, leave with dignity. Chiang Kai-shek said, fine, get out of China. And they should have gotten out. And eventually that's what they did. But the problem was they wanted to do it in ways that would disguise the stupidity and idiocy of having gone in to begin with. This has a huge impact on all great powers that suffer from terminal cases of national narcissism. It also is a problem because people immediately assume that they have limitless power and influence. You never do. It doesn't matter who you are. And so all of these things have been learned the hard way in the past. But each time we engage in this, you have a new group of luminaries in Washington, D.C. who decide that this time it will be different and they will get everything right. And what's really disturbing is to listen to some of these retired officers who were part of this debacle and really actually privately knew better, come out publicly and say, oh, we should go back. We should go back and fix this. This is terrible. This is surrender. Well, first of all, what were you trying to win to begin with? Right. Nobody ever has a good answer. What are you winning? Where's the payoff? Of course, this is what the Japanese discovered in China. There was nothing to win. There was great value in seizing Malaya and Indonesia. At one point in 1943, the Japanese were sitting on top of the largest concentration of rubber and oil in the world. It made infinite sense to go down there, but it made no sense whatsoever from a practical standpoint to go into China.
It reminds me of, I think, when the Nazis invaded, Sweden, didn't Winston Churchill say something to the effect, or great, more flies to the fly paper?
No, they didn't. Sweden was always pro-German, frankly, until the war was almost over. So were the Swiss. Okay. We have a lot of false impressions of what happened in Europe during World War II. No, I think there were some assumptions about the Germans in Russia. But the more information that we are discovering, and this is one of the chapters that I wrote in Margin of Victory about the Russo-German War. And the more we look at it, the more we discover that I think more than anything else, we defeated Germany and Russia. And the reason I say that is Lend-Lease, because there are very few people that understand that in July of 1941, Harry Hopkins was sent by FDR to meet with Stalin. And essentially, Stalin handed him a wish list of everything from aluminum to steel to weapons to tanks and aircraft. And we supplied these things in enormous quantities. When the Germans arrived in Stalingrad, they were stunned at the fact that they were overrunning positions that had thousands of US-made trucks and Jeeps. And frankly, people don't know this, but we also sent enormous numbers of Sherman tanks to Russia. But the Russians said, we will not accept any Sherman tanks unless they have diesel engines. So the Russians, or the Soviets, the communists, received all the Shermans with diesel engines. Our soldiers were given these damn things with gasoline engines, which is why they referred to the Sherman during World War II as the Zippo lighter. There's so much that went on during that war that it's hard to imagine. We really rescued the Soviet Union from certain destruction.
Yeah, in fact, it's my understanding no less than 3/4 of the entire Wehrmacht was fighting against the Soviets. I don't think the Americans really appreciate that. I mean, the bulk of the Germans were fighting this huge Soviet juggernaut. And it's just amazing to me. The Eastern Front is one of the most fascinating wars in history. In fact, I saw a stat once that I think it was if you killed 17,000 people per day, every day for 4 years, you would just have the casualties of the Russian front.
Well, we now know that the Soviets lost at least 40 million, or twice what they originally admitted. We also know that there were 1.5 million so-called Soviet citizens in the Wehrmacht. Wow. There were 750,000 Russians who effectively joined the Wehrmacht on the battlefield, 250,000 Ukrainians, and another 500,000 Turks, Armenians, Georgians, and others. This doesn't even begin to talk about the numbers of Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians also, working with the Wehrmacht. It really was a crusade against communism. And the sad part is that Hitler would not simply turn this into a war of liberation. Even Himmler tried to convince him that, look, if you'll just let us take the Soviet prisoners of war, of which there were 3 million, we can field armies equipped with all of the captured Soviet equipment that will fight shoulder to shoulder with us to liberate the Soviet Union from communism. He wouldn't do it. So you had some of it, but it was very modest. So instead of just 1.5 million, there would have been 2 or 3 million people fighting against communism. And we don't understand the British General Staff, when you go through their papers during the Second War, which obviously this did not get into the chapter because it was beyond the purview of the book. From the very beginning, they were extremely, extremely concerned about Churchill's wholehearted support of communism and Stalin, pointing out that, frankly, from the standpoint of the British Empire, communism was a far greater threat to Britain than National Socialism. And Churchill discarded it, threw caution to the winds. He said, well, they're tying down 250 German divisions. Well, it's one thing to tie down 250 German divisions. It's quite another to enable the movement of tens of millions of Soviet troops into Europe. And unfortunately, that's what happens. And I think we all lost sight of the difference between tying down German forces and enabling the conquest of Central East Europe by communism, which, of course, then leaves us with another war to fight, doesn't it? An even more destructive, more costly war than the Second World War.
So since you brought up the Soviets, is modern day Russia the Soviet Union? And that's all I hear today.
Yeah, well, that's crazy, and it's utter nonsense. I think what you can say about someone like Putin, for instance, everyone wants to point out his KGB experience. But a lot of people don't realize that the people in the KGB were among the best educated and, frankly, the most widely read and widely traveled people in the Soviet Union. They actually understood the West. Perhaps Putin understands the West better than almost anyone else in the country today because he spends so much time in it. No, I think Putin is a good example of someone in Russia who has one foot in Tsarist Russia and another foot in the old Soviet Union. And that's essentially what you're looking at today, people that are a hybrid of those two experiences. And of the two, I would argue, the Tsarist experience is ultimately more important. And that's why you see the restoration of Orthodox Christianity as the state religion, because it's inextricably intertwined with Russian nationalism, just as Roman Catholicism is inextricably intertwined with Polish nationalism. So no, you're not dealing with the Soviet Union at all. And remember, they've also shed most of the non-Russians. They have some non-Russians in their country, but a very small number compared with what they had in the Soviet Union. So today's Russia is as close to a true Russian state as we've seen in a long time. And I think there are a lot of misunderstandings about Ukraine and the nature of the problem in Ukraine, what Russia's real concerns are. And then, of course, we've got to understand something else. These borders in that part of the world have changed repeatedly over hundreds of years. And so when you say Ukraine, it depends on which century and at which particular point in time Ukraine is Ukraine. And then not all Ukrainians are the same. Ukraine is actually surprisingly multinational in many respects, more so even than Russia. So again, we keep imposing our views of the world, our perceptions on others, and then demanding that they match whatever standard we set for others. Of course, all of this against the backdrop of what's happening in our country right now, which is the destruction of the rule of law, real questions about election integrity, questions about just who these people are who are currently governing us, because they certainly don't look like Democrats. I grew up with large numbers of Democrats, and they were as patriotic and devoted to the country as any Republican I've ever met. That certainly doesn't seem to be the case with this group. So we've got so many problems ourselves. We're in no position at this stage, I think, to preach to others regarding what they ought to be.
No, I think it's a fantastic point. And in fact, that's a great segue in your book. So for the audience here, and I will have a link to this, Margin of Victory. I read this and I was blown away. So first of all, the writing, the writing is so crisp and clean. I'm a big stickler for writing. It's so concise, to the point, and it's so interesting. And your theme that wars are decided in the decades before they begin. Oh my Lord! All the conditions you just mentioned now, and then 20 years of endless war in Iraq and Afghanistan. You have an inept, corrupt senior military. God knows what's being taught now in the military academies to the ranks of our officers. You know, if a war happened in the next 5-10 years, I'm not too confident we could actually prevail. Maybe I'm being too much of a pessimist, but just taking what you wrote, that wars are decided in decades before they begin. Am I being a pessimist, or what do you think?
No, I think you're very realistic, unfortunately. I don't think today's military is remotely prepared for what I would call, in the book I mentioned, is a war of decision. Clausewitz talked about wars of observation versus wars of decision. In other words, what we would call these low-intensity conflicts, Clausewitz called them wars of observation, because whether you won or lost them really was not a question existential in character. In other words, your country did not necessarily stand or fall on what happened in these wars of observation. And ultimately, he says, wars of observation can be fought if you're trying to test your capabilities, test your limits, or you feel that there's some minor issue here that could be decided in your favor. But wars of decision are very different. World War I, World War II, even the Korean War, these were wars of decision. In other words, they decided a critical outcome that was of vital strategic interest to the American people. Now, with regard to Korea, Eisenhower was smart enough to understand that there was nothing vital on the Korean Peninsula, but he also understood that we had to restore the status quo ante, come to some sort of arrangement and end it. And he understood the criticality of ending that war, because if he didn't, it could grow and it could consume resources and human lives that we, frankly, in the United States didn't want to spend. But after that, you have simply wars of observation. Or these low-intensity conflicts. Those kinds of conflicts tend to breed bad senior officer leadership, because the senior officers are not in a position where decisions they make could result in the deaths of tens of thousands, could put the existence of their state at risk. I refer to it often in there as colonial warfare, where you sort of sit in your forward operating base, which is a kind of a modern metaphor for the French Foreign Legion post or the British post outside of Islamabad, in Northwest India. And the general makes a decision to go somewhere, do something to fight the local tribe or whatever else, but he doesn't necessarily become involved. And he has such an overwhelming advantage in firepower that almost anything that you do will work. And that's been our problem, that quite frankly, I remember talking to Dave Petraeus back in 2005, and I said, this is not much of a contest, to whatever agreement that you come to isn't going to be terribly meaningful. And he said, well, that's true. Doug, they know who have the attack helicopters and gunships. That's true. They understand that. Well, what a stupid remark. What do you think you're accomplishing? And again, there's always this threat of violence, and then there's some use of violence, but not on the scale that's necessary to make an impact, because there's no interest in doing so. So this is a sort of a vicious circle. You keep going round and round and round until somebody says, that's enough. We've spent enough money. We've lost enough lives. Let's go home. And once you're out, you're out. It doesn't matter. Nothing happening in Iraq today is going to affect us very much. But what's happening in Iraq today is going to have a profound impact on the Turks, on the Iranians, and of course, on the Arabs in the region. And who are the two great powers in the region historically? Turks and Persians. And what are they prepared to fight over? They're prepared to fight over northern Iraq. Gosh, what a shock. At least they know what they're fighting for, which is control of oil fields, and they want an advantage over each other. So the question is, what are we doing there? I haven't figured it out. And I always like my friends in the IDF. One of them's a general, and he says, Douglas, when your enemies are killing each other, don't interrupt. My view is, and I don't necessarily regard everyone as the enemy, but my point is, what's in it for us? And this was the thing that I think appealed to so many people about Donald Trump, because he asked this critical question. What's in it for us? What's the return on our investment of blood and treasure? And the answer is nothing. And if you start talking about Ukraine, you have to ask, where's the return on our investment there? What's in it for us? And they immediately get all these arguments. Well, it's democracy, 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 and human rights. Well, wait a minute. Have you been there? What you term democracy probably doesn't fit very well. Human rights, as you understand them, are not widely agreed. In other words, there are more things in play. It is more complex than that, and we can't sort it out, nor should we try. So anyhow, that's the frustrating part. And my concern was all of this is going to end, all these interventions, these low-intensity conflicts, and then at some point we will have to fight someone who can fight back, and it may make a difference to us. In other words, our existence could be at stake. So what are we going to do about it? And it's not that I'm anxious to find that fight, but you want to be prepared for it. Now, that doesn't mean you live in a state of siege. In other words, the money we're spending now and the numbers, it's just outrageous nonsense. But you have to maintain core capabilities that allow you to fight if you're compelled to do so. That's a very different philosophy from what we've seen over the last 30 years. Notice what I said. If you are compelled to do so, if you have to fight. Everyone has acted as though, well, we can go anywhere, anytime we want and fight anybody we like. War has lost its meaning to the American people. War is something that happens on somebody else's soil. They don't understand that a war with China, with the Russians, even the Turks, Iranians, I don't know who it could be, that will visit us here in North America. People need to wake up. It's very different from what they think now.
There's a great quote by Lee, and it's I think it's at Fredericksburg, where he mentions I think it's the attack on Marie's Heights, and the Union is just dissolving. And he said it is good that war is so awful, for we grow too fond of it. And the fact that it's off our shores, it's on other people's land. It's very disturbing. It really is disturbing. And frankly, one of the things I wanted to ask you, you brought up Clausewitz. Clausewitz always talked about the nature, understanding the nature of the conflict. And I was saying about what is the nature of war? War is ugly. It is death and destruction. And I feel like, I don't know if it's the education or it's just the institution, especially for our generals. It feels like they're trying to be too smart by half. Like, we can go around and not have to say, we don't have to kill our enemy. We can neutralize them. We can put all this soft language and actually ignore the actual nature of warfare. I feel like that's really been lost. I mean, my God, if I went on national TV and said the essence of the army is to kill people and break things, they think I'm a madman.
Well, that's an example of just how deranged the ruling class in the United States has become. And of course, most Americans do not have a real appreciation for any of this sort of thing. I remember I grew up in the 50s and the 60s, and virtually everyone's father in the neighborhood where I grew up in Philadelphia had served in the Korean War or World War II or both. So you had this vast reserve of people who really did know what war was like. And it's unsurprising that they found Eisenhower very refreshing, because Eisenhower understood it, and he was bound and determined that we were going to do that again, because he knew that we couldn't. We also forget that when we were on the winning side, if you will, in World War I and World War II, we sort of tipped the balance in both cases against the opponent, Germany or Japan. But we weren't alone. And we're largely alone now, because if you look at the so-called European allies, these are not major allies anymore. The British Empire is gone. The French Empire is gone. They're very small forces. Those forces are really only able to augment us in a modest way. And so what we've got instead of allies are what I would call military protectorates. And quite frankly, we can't afford them anymore, which is, again, the argument for getting out of these places and getting out of Europe and getting out of Northeast Asia. If you look at South Korea, for instance, about 49 million Koreans in South Korea. They are, I think, 10th or 11th in the world in terms of overall scientific industrial power and capacity. They outstrip Russia dramatically. There are 140 million people in Russia. There are only 49 people in South Korea. And Russia is an economic dwarf when it stands next to South Korea. If you look at their forces, the South Koreans right now have an arsenal of tactical ballistic missiles and rockets that, quite frankly, is better than anything you're going to find in the U.S. Army. They have excellent equipment. They're well-disciplined troops. What are we doing there? North Korea is circling the drain. The place is a catastrophe. And there are real questions about this so-called nuclear capability. And the point that everybody loses sight of is that Xi in Beijing, for instance, has made it very clear to Kim, if you start a war, you're on your own. We will do nothing for you. However, if you are attacked, we will consider helping you. So under the circumstances, what are we doing on the Korean Peninsula? What are we doing in any number? What are we doing in Japan? For instance, Okinawa is smaller than Loudoun County, Virginia.
Oh, wow.
So if you look at the missiles, the theater ballistic, short-range ballistic missiles that are available in China to be aimed at Okinawa, in the first few minutes of a war with China, everything in Okinawa would be erased. War has changed. Everyone thinks in terms of World War II. We were not prepared for the Second World War. We were woefully unprepared. People were very concerned with FDR when he embargoed the Japanese, because they knew that if we embargoed the Japanese, prevented them from any access to oil whatsoever, along with other critical capabilities, they would eventually attack. And Admiral Stark, who was chief of naval operations, advised him against putting the fleet in Pearl Harbor. MacArthur and Marshall worked tirelessly to try and neutralize the Philippines and get our forces out. We weren't prepared for a war in the Pacific. And Stark kept trying to get FDR to stop provoking the Germans and stop provoking the Japanese, because he said, we're not capable of fighting a two-front war. In the Pacific, we had 11 oil tankers in the whole fleet, just 11. And our war plans at the time called for the entire fleet to sortie and go straight across the Pacific to relieve the beleaguered garrison in the Philippines. Well, that was an impossibility. You only had 11 tankers. How far were you going to get? Over 8,000 miles. And ultimately, what did we do? We fell back. We abandoned the Western Pacific. And we had two outposts besides Alaska, Midway, and Hawaii, and then Panama. That was our defense perimeter. That was as much as we could cope with. And quite frankly, had the Japanese been a little smarter than they were and focused their combat power on Hawaii instead of dissipating it all over Asia, they could have seized the Hawaiian Islands, and it would have taken us 2+ years to even begin retaking the Hawaiian Islands. So we weren't prepared. We got very lucky. Nobody seems to understand that now. We can't do that sort of thing again. We cannot withstand initial defeats and then bounce back, because there's nobody else out there but us.
Yeah. Going back to your book, I have a personal question for you. What chapter? All these battles are amazing. I personally love the Russian German Bagration, but I was fascinated with 73 Easting. What was your favorite chapter? Which one do you have most fun writing?
Well, there was, believe it or not, a rationale. I don't know. Can you hear me? Are we still together?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I got you. There was a rationale for why these various battles were selected, because some people said, well, the first battle of the First World War really wasn't pivotal. Actually, it was, because the British showed up ready to fight a war that was very different from the one they encountered. And that was my point. And they were not unique. Most of the European powers had decided that a future war would be one of maneuver and mobility. And so the British put their resources, which were fairly scarce for the army, into a very highly trained, small professional force that could move rapidly to wherever it had to fight and move around the battlefield as needed. So they invested in what I would call light and medium artillery that could be used largely in direct fire. And they trained their infantry to be very, very accurate with rifle fire and competent in that sense. But they never completely appreciated the value of the machine gun. I think there were only 1 or 2 machine guns per infantry battalion. Of course, by the time the war ends, all of that sort of thing changes. Even the Germans didn't bring that many machine guns with them initially, but it didn't take long for the Germans to figure out that the firepower was the enabler for everything on the battlefield. But their force was almost annihilated in the first month of the First World War, but they just weren't prepared for the impact of artillery, machine guns. This is long before they went into the trenches, and they make this almost 200 to 300 mile retreat to try and survive, and they barely manage it. But understanding why the British made their decisions was very important to understanding the outcome of the first battle. And then it was important to try and get people to understand that we've got to be very careful what we assume about the future. I read all sorts of interesting articles on a routine basis about the miraculous robots that are going to replace people, so that robots will be crawling all over the battlefield. Well, the problem with that sort of thing is this fraudulent notion of AI, artificial intelligence. There is no definition for it. But the truth is, there is no machine equivalent of you or me. So when you put a man into the driver's seat of a tank or an armored fighting vehicle, and you cross, there's no understanding that millions of decisions are made in a fraction of a second by that soldier who's driving that vehicle. We haven't even begun to talk about everybody else who's on board and what they do. Turning that into a robot is extremely difficult, expensive, and not likely to happen. On the other hand, in the air or at sea, you're in a different medium. And you can do a number of things in those mediums that you simply cannot do in the terrestrial environment on land. So I think there's some false expectations about what can or cannot be done. But the thing that we are missing is the potential for the delivery of accurate, devastating firepower in great volume against any point on the planet whenever we want to do it. And that's where the Russians have put their money. That's where the Chinese are putting their money. And we need to do much of the same thing. And what this does, I call it ISR strike. And I talk about the integration of ISR, strike, maneuver, and sustainment. But that ISR strike connectivity changes everything on the battlefield. When the British went to war in 1914, they were going to use their artillery and direct fire. And while they were waiting for the Germans to close with them, they looked up and they were surprised to see a little airplane. They would drop various colored ribbons. And then within a minute or two of those ribbons dropping, German artillery began falling all around them. And they finally figured out, well, every time you see this plane, you'd better take cover because the artillery's coming. Seems very, very bizarre, but that's the beginning of ISR strike. Today, we have space-based capabilities. We have all sorts of redundant capabilities beyond space, essentially sensors from seabed to space right now. all of which can be linked to terminally guided weapon systems. And these weapon systems will destroy you very quickly. We had a Ukrainian brigade just a few years ago that decided they wanted to pull into an open field. This is several miles from the front to organize themselves. And within the space of about 5 minutes, they came under rocket artillery fire, and the whole brigade of about 2,700 men and their vehicles was annihilated.
Wow. Wow.
By Russian artillery. If you look at the BM-21 rocket artillery system, and you look at MLRS, the MLRS is throwing a golf ball, and the BM-21 is essentially sending the equivalent of a Volkswagen downrange. Do you understand? We said, well, we're improving our MLRS. Well, it's not good enough. You need new systems with far more striking power, explosive power. Why launch a golf ball that can land outside of Moscow if you want? What difference is it going to make? None. So one platoon of BM-21 can cover all of Central Park in a salvo. Well, look at the size of Central Park and imagine that you are standing there as a human being in the open. You're not going to survive. You won't last. So all of these systems are now there. We've gone from 1914 to 1921 by the time, or 1991. By the time this ends, you have a glimpse of just how radical the improvements are in these capabilities. And that changes how you fight on the ground.
Again, I love the book. I found it amazing. I didn't realize even the term margin of victory. I think people think of battles, one side wins, one side loses, but that inch, that thing that you do prior to the fight and making sure the fight is successful. It's amazing. And for me, I would pass this to senior executives. I would totally recommend. There's a business book, which is, it's not obviously not about war, but it's called Only the Paranoid Survive by Andy Grove. And, Intel was saved by his leadership in the sense that he ensured that constant development, they'll accept failure, constant development. As you say, wars are decided in the decades before they begin. Well, getting ready to that point of hyper competition. So to me, this is a fantastic book. You have such a fascinating biography. I've seen people call you the modern day Billy Mitchell. You fought in the last great tank battle of the 20th century. Not just fought, but my understanding, you helped direct it at 73 Easting. I read an article about you at NTC. You set a record. Was it 3 wins, 1 draw, and 1 loss? It was unheard of. And then you published Breaking the Phalanx, I think in 97, a book that was mandatory reading about transformation. So my question to you is, where did this start? Why did you join the Army? That's first of all, where are you from and why did you join the Army?
Oh, gosh. I was 5 years old and my mother took me to West Point on a visit. And after I had visited the place, I told her I'm going to go to West Point. So I think that's where it began. And I really never deviated from that path. One of the reasons I went to Virginia Military Institute for a year was that I had not been appointed the first time around to West Point. And I really didn't know much about VMI. My grandfather, I grew up in my maternal grandfather's home. He summoned me to his room and announced to me that he had found a place for me to spend a year before I ultimately went to West Point. And he said, it's a place called VMI. You will like it. You will enjoy it very much. Of course, when I reported to VMI on the first day and someone stopped me on the way through the Jackson Arch and said, give me 72 push-ups for the class of 72, I then discovered that my grandfather was a sick sadist because I said, this is not necessarily what I signed up for. So VMI was probably the best thing that ever happened to me because nothing could have prepared me better. And it also was a place that inculcated strong values of service and integrity and honor and so forth in ways that I don't think we did nearly as well at West Point. And I saw many standards of discipline at that point in 1971 in terms of your appearance and drilling and marching and all these kinds of things were vastly superior to what I found later on going to West Point. And later I read the Patton papers, and I found that General Patton's comments about West Point and VMI mirrored my own. One of the things he said, well, West Point is a much more gentlemanly atmosphere. No one can touch you. Whereas at VMI could touch you. And I do remember an upper class, he was a first classman. And I don't really to this day completely know what the hell I did, but he pulled me out of the rat line and held me up against the wall for doing something. And then he said, do you understand? And of course, I wasn't going to say no. I have no goddamn idea what you're talking about. I said, yes, sir. And he put me back in the rat line and off I went. And of course, we had all these horror stories, most of which are true about what it was like in the rat line in those years. I mean, you would run in place until you threw up. And then when you were finished throwing up, you would run again some more. I mean, it was a much rougher environment, but it was a good preparation for the military academy. It gave me a different perspective because most of the people that go to West Point are 18, straight out of high school. They've never seen anything else. That's all they know. And so there's no ability to sort of stand back, evaluate what is or isn't good or what might be different. So from the very beginning, I was inclined to think a little differently about things. Second thing that had a big impact on me was being an exchange student in Germany from 1969 to 1970. And I went to a very fine Quaker men's private school. I was raised as a Quaker, believe it or not. And I competed for a spot to study in Germany, and the American Friends Services Committee sent me to northern Germany to a town in English called Brunswick, Braunschweig in German. And I ended up living with a family the father of which had been an officer in the Wehrmacht and had actually served in the German army from about 1931 till 1945. And he had seen a lot of action. He was a combat engineer, but typical for the officer class, very well educated. His hobby was Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and biblical texts. He was very interested in archaeology and so forth. He had a big impact because he eventually discovered that I was not going to reproach him for being an evil Nazi. I just wanted to know about him and his experiences in the military. And then he began to teach me a great deal. And so an awful lot of what happens in 1991 and 1990, 91, when I had the opportunity to sort of mold the 2nd Squadron, 2nd Cavalry for action, these 1,100 men, 42 tanks, 42 Bradleys, 8 guns. And then subsequently what I'm able to do with the 1st and the 4th Cavalry after the war from 92 to 94 really reflected that German influence. Because the Germans were very, very big on simplicity, big on what I would call orders from the saddle. In other words, discarding these detailed written orders in favor of a highly trained battle drill oriented force to the point where the battle drills were automatic. And then you would improvise based on the existing battle drill to deal with the situation that you encountered, which you knew was always going to be a little different from what you originally intended or anticipated. And then the idea that you have to be at the front. You know, I had to fight very hard to be in a tank. And the reason I wanted a tank was it was simply faster to move in that. And there was nothing that you could not do. And if you had to fight to influence the battle, you could have a profound impact with just one tank. So I ended up doing that. And then when I was at Fort Riley, the NTC provided a wonderful test ground to test out some other ideas and things. And I had 12 NCOs and officers who'd served with me in the 2nd Cavalry who joined me in the 1st and the 4th. So I had a good cadre there that understood the thinking, the rationale, and it paid huge dividends. Now, it didn't make me very popular. And some of the people that went on to command battalions and squadrons later on who were captains or majors, he told me the first thing they got when they showed up at a division was that we don't want any of this McGregor stuff. Don't come in here and try to do anything new or different. Just do your job. In other words, don't question anything. Just go and do what everybody else does. And one of the things that I didn't like was this notion of, well, you learn by failing. My argument was, well, you can, but you also learn by success. And if you do something and it works, you don't forget it. You can do it again. You don't have to fail at everything on the assumption that having failed, you've learned something. What if you didn't learn how to do it better? Or just because you failed, well, that didn't work. What else are we going to do? And I found that most of what the U.S. Army doctrine was telling people to do made no sense. It was going to get everybody killed in a real fight with a real enemy. Now, we haven't had to deal with that very much, fortunately. And so we've kind of atrophied. And we spend too much time congratulating ourselves on how wonderful we are and how much better we are than everybody else. It's a catastrophe. So my personal nightmare from 91 onward was really that we would end up like the Prussian army at Jena Auerstedt in 1806. The Prussians went out there and they were essentially organized, trained, and equipped exactly as they had been under Frederick the Great during the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763. So they were this permanent tribute or replica of the army that was successful in 1763 and 1806. Along comes the Grand Army under Napoleon, and we know the rest of the story. They annihilated the Prussians, destroyed them. So my concern is that, we end up with somebody we didn't expect who has figured out ISR, strike, maneuver, and sustainment, how to integrate those, has changed the way it fights, and ultimately devastates us. And I testified in 2017 in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Air-Land Subcommittee, and I tried to make that point, but it fell on deaf ears. And I tried to describe what we would experience. The first thing, you get to the battlefield, there are all sorts of sensors operating, and those are not all obvious. But the point is that forms of overhead surveillance are going to detect you, as well as things on the ground. The next thing that happens is loitering munitions that come in to pick and choose from the various targets on the ground. In other words, command and control or logistics, whatever they decide is important. And then very shortly after these things are confirmed, in comes the rocket artillery, and the tactical ballistic missiles are headed over your head to destroy the command and control structure behind you. As this all happens very quickly, and you have to organize for this. You have to be widely dispersed, which puts a premium on leadership at the lowest level. But you also have to have tactical air and missile defense. You have to have the ability to acquire these things, because if you've got tactical air and missile defense and you have radars that allow you to acquire these things, you can defeat the things above you. But at the same time, you've got to move. If you are static for any length of time, you're going to be found, targeted, and destroyed. So all of these things were not widely appreciated, and everybody sort of said, oh, well, that's nice. And now we're beginning to see it. We've seen it in Nagorno-Karabakh in Armenia. We've gotten a good taste of it from the Azeri Turks using the loitering munitions and rocket artillery. It's the tip of a proverbial iceberg.
I'm curious, because I know you graduated with an engineering degree. Am I correct on that?
Yes, we all got Bachelor of Science in General Engineering, which was very tough on me because I needed a case of no-dos to get through most of those subjects.
So the reason I ask it, because when I look at your biography and I look at your history, I'm talking to myself, here's an engineer, here's a person. And again, when I think of engineer, I think of civil or mechanical engineer. I'm like, here's a person who lives in a world of rules, of systems, of proven systems. But then I see your performance at 73 Easting, at NTC, your book, Breaking the Phalanx, which it really is. This was, if I remember correctly, getting rid of divisions, of breaking units down to 5,000 to 6,000 men. In fact, I read a book a long time ago about command and control. Is it Crevel? And I think you talk about how the Romans, the legion was just an administrative word. It was the actual cohorts. And I'm like, so I just, to me, it's almost like a paradox. Here's a person who thrived in a system built of rules, and yet you're such a global thinker, and you put it on paper, and you had, from my reading, it was required reading for generals, except you became the tallest poppy in the field. And
I think that's a good way to describe it. Yeah. And, it came very close to implementation, many of these things. General Reimer was the chief of staff at the time. He spent almost 3 hours with me, and then he said at the end of the discussion, he said, I think you're right, number one. Number two, I know we can do this. He said, three, I know that the joint community will welcome this, these mission-focused capability packages under 1-stars. He said, I know that the Hill will like this. But he said, how do I sell this in the Army? And the full colonel that had commanded me in 91 was then a 3-star. His name was Holder. And General Holder looked at him and said, well, sir, you're the chief of staff of the Army. Well, they ultimately, this was in February, I guess, or March. And in May or late April, they had a meeting with the Army 4-stars. I guess they had 7 of them at the time. And believe it or not, they voted on this sort of blueprint that I had outlined. And there was 1 vote for it, and everyone else was against it. And so Reimer said, well, I can't implement this. That's no way to run an army.
No.
And one of the things I keep trying to tell people is in 1940-41, during the Louisiana maneuvers, they discovered a lot of things. One of the things they discovered was that they needed to organize into the German battle groups inside the armored divisions. We used to call them combat commands. They also had finally gone to triangular divisions, which again was another German innovation from the early 20s. And that had been fought tirelessly for 17, 18 years. But they were still fighting the combat command structure and instead wanted to have this large amorphous armored division. Marshall listened to it. He said, all right, all armor divisions will be converted to combat command divisions. Next question. And there was this huge sigh of relief from the people that were in those formations that were trying to do these things. You have to have someone in charge. See, the problem in the Department of Defense right now is no one's in charge. This is the problem in imaginary, fictional. You have services. The service chiefs have all the money. The service chiefs are preeminently concerned about keeping what they have and changing nothing. Oh, they'll buy some new gadgets. But as far as altering the structure, changing the way they fight, forget it. They're not interested in that because their structure is tied to career patterns, tied to promotion systems, tied to bureaucratic policies with which they are all comfortable. So I finally concluded that there are only 2 ways things change. One is war, and the other is revolution. Sometimes you get one before the other. Sometimes you get both together, and then you get changes. But rarely do you get fundamental change. I did have a couple of examples with the British before World War I, which is the first chapter. They actually did make a lot of changes that made a lot of sense. The problem was that the army was never designed to go to France and fight on that kind of battlefield against the greatest army in the world, the Imperial German Army. It was designed to go to India. It was designed to go to the Baltic littoral. It was designed to do all sorts of things, but not for the purpose for which it was ultimately destined. The Germans got a lot of things right, but they never got it all right because they didn't have the resources and there wasn't enough leadership at the top to make it happen. And the Soviets were in a different position. They took terrible losses. They had us replenishing everything and ultimately were able to get most of it right, at least on the operational level. And on the operational level, that's very important. And we've never understood that. I mean, I give an example of Eisenhower spends 8 or 9 months negotiating with the Army Air Corps about targets that he wants to attack in Normandy. And finally, after 8 or 9 months of struggling, there's an agreement reached. Well, one of the things that was impressive about Operation Bagration that you pointed to was that Zhukov at one point, who is commanding one of the 3 groups of fronts, finds that there are 50,000 German troops encircled outside of Minsk. And this time the Germans can't break out because they're encircled by armor and artillery, not infantry. And he then turns to his, what we would call strike commander, and says, I want every available aircraft immediately to attack these Germans who are surrounded. Within 15 minutes, you get over 1,000 aircraft over the battlefield that absolutely annihilate these Germans, most of whom are infantry that have nowhere to hide on the battlefield. Incomprehensible. But there's also this other lesson that comes through again and again and again, and that is, if you have no unity of command, there is no unity of effort. We never really had unity of command. Even the Germans had problems with unity of command. For instance, as the German army was advancing to Stalingrad, the army commanders begged the German Air Force not to bomb Stalingrad, because it was their experience that a bombed out city was more difficult to take than a city that was intact. Well, the commander of German air forces in southern Russia ignored them.
I've always called the Germans, they always had a divided division of labor. It's amazing.
And when you look at the command structure in air-land battle, it's a catastrophe, because you have all these single service headquarters, and you are spending yourself into bankruptcy trying to connect all of them. And that's not the answer. The answer is, instead of 40 or 50 single service headquarters, the answer is 10 or 15 that are integrated, inherently joint, that have all the connectivity they need, but there is unity of command at every level. We don't have it. We don't want it. The Russians have it. They've learned. Now, the interesting thing is the Chinese really don't have it, but it's by design, because the Chinese political leadership doesn't trust the military. And they have a long history of warlordism in China. And so they're afraid of regional commanders trying to strike out on their own and do their own thing. So the Chinese are by design fragmented. We really don't understand the vast differences between China and Russia. We tend to lump them all together. And China is, I would say, very incapable of offensive operations. The only thing they can do very well is defend China. And if you look at their investments and the way they're set up, they're turning China into Fortress China, designed to essentially prevent us from interfering with them. The Russians are entirely different. They have an offensive mindset. Their force structure is more agile, and they're quite capable now of offensive operations. Limited because they don't have the money or the numbers, but it's a vast difference between them and the Chinese.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating. I promised you 1 hour, and I'm going to keep my word. For the audience here, I know you mentioned you spent 1 year of VMI, and for the audience, the rule of VMI is if you survive your rat year, you're actually a VMI grad. So,
yeah. Well, you're an alumnus.
Alumnus, yes, you're an alumnus. So it's really, I thoroughly appreciate you taking your time to talk to me. Again, I'm a big fan. Your book, Margin of Victory, and I'll have the information on the website. I highly recommend to the listeners, read it. It is amazing. But again, the writing's so crisp and clear, but your ability to analyze, to really take apart all the critical elements. And frankly, again, the theme that wars are decided in the decades before they begin is so powerful. If you're an executive, you need to learn to do the right things now, because in the next year or two, who knows what's going to happen? You should be better prepared. So
I was talking to an audience recently about the book, and I said, look, I know that people don't like to read books. So do what most West Point cadets do. Everybody sort of stopped to listen. I said, read the introduction and read the concluding chapter, if nothing else. Of course, everybody laughed, but I was quite serious. If you don't want to work your way through these 5 battles, which are really 5 snapshots in time to understand the issues that you pointed to, this development of this ISR strike capability over time, and how this all begins 10, 20 years before the battle, then at least read the introduction and conclusions. We have too many people in the military that are absorbed with what I call the bright, shining object. Oh, there's a new technology I can buy that will do this nifty thing for me. It's not the answer. It's holistic. And our problems in defense, much like our problems in many other areas, are structural and require comprehensive change. That, of course, is the thing that nobody wants to do. And sadly, when you don't do it, or make a pretty damn good attempt to do it, that's when you end up having to do it after you have been badly embarrassed on the battlefield.